All right. So we're the Platypus Affiliated Society. We're a group about examining the death of the left. And I'm from the Colombia chapter of the organization. And today we will discuss the meaning of the American Revolution from the perspective of the left. We have three panelists that will discuss the 1619 controversial MIT project. And we have Markowitz, Markowitz.
Yes.
We have Bertell Ollman and Chris Cotron. And I will warn you at like 13 minutes speaking time. You have 15 minutes, but please feel free to extend. I'll just make
With
it
three of us, we might be able to do 20.
Oh,
With three of us,
all
we
right,
might
then.
be able
I
to
think
do
20 is good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll warn you at 18.
Okay. Okay. So let me quickly begin. First, the left isn't dead. It wasn't dead in 1848 when it was proclaimed dead, and the revolutions of 1848 were crushed. It wasn't dead in 1871 when the Paris Commune was crushed. It wasn't dead in the 1920s when the Soviet Revolution began to be isolated, and throughout Europe and America, Fordism, people's capitalism was hailed. It wasn't dead when the Cold War, which began in 1947 and continues to this day, not the Soviet US part of it, led to devastation and misery and suffering in much of the world, and endless neo-colonial wars. In 1991, when the Soviet Union was destroyed or dismembered, I would say in a counter-revolution, history was proclaimed as being over. The capitalists had won. 19th century, laissez-faire capitalism had won. This was the way of the future. We see in the world today, with the rise of neo-fascism, the continuation of laissez-faire capitalism called neoliberalism, and the assault on all the gains that the working people of the developed world and the people of the former colonial regions face in their struggle. That the movement for socialism and against imperialism, and if the left is not that, it's nothing. It's nothing. It's not only dead, but it remains the future. Now, let me begin as quickly as I can deal with the American Revolution. Kevin asked me a few questions about the American Revolution. Was it a revolution? Was it really revolutionary? What can we learn from it? What can we take from it? Should we support it? Should we support it? Okay. The American Revolution was a revolution. Revolutions are complicated things. They're political, social, their foundation is also economic. The revolution that took place in North America was directly related to the first big revolution for capitalism, the British Revolution, the Puritan Revolution of the 17th century. That revolution resulted in a revolutionary army, the New Model Army, the execution of the absolutist king, the establishment of a revolutionary dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, which collapsed, and the restoration of a monarchy, but a monarchy in which, within a generation, Parliament and the state represented the interests of merchants and gentry. That was seen in North America, the North American colonies, with the enormous power that the Board of Trade had in determining relationships between the metropolitan center of London and the colonies. In the colonies, the radical expressions of that revolution had their voices. The real bourgeois democratic levelers, the followers of Gerard Winstanley Diggers, seen by many historians, myself included, as the first, even with their religious views, communists. They were all, of course, crushed. In the North American colonies, as development was carried forward. And the indentured servants, indentured laborers, rose up in Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. The response was to put down the rebellion, but also to begin to import more and more slaves. In North America, by the 18th century, there were three sections of an emerging capitalist class. The good news was there were no aristocrats, monarchs, hereditary aristocracy. The not so good news was that there were slaveholders along with the landed gentry and the merchant capitalists. Now, the British Empire was in the process of, with its bourgeois revolution, becoming the most powerful empire in the world, and like all empires, particularly empires of merchant capitalist empires, what it did was to have its colonies produce raw materials cheaply and purchase finished goods at high prices to keep its colonies capital poor. The North American colonies were treated in this way. The North American colonies also were pawns in a whole series of wars between the two great empires of the 18th century, the British Empire and the French Empire, which was absolutist, more backward in many ways, but powerful, very powerful. To make a long story short, great revolutions are often the consequence of great wars. The Great War of the 18th century, the war of commercial or merchant capitalism, was between the British and French Empire. It was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, the French and Indian War in the United States. It was also a war for control of India. It was a global war. It resulted in a sweeping victory for the British Empire. The British Empire gained control of all of North America. It consolidated its position in India. Its European position remained solid. And in the aftermath of that war, which was very costly, the new British conservative government, Tory, still the word used for conservative, began to impose a series of policies on its North American colonies to prevent the development of an independent national capitalist class. Slaveholders, landowners, and merchant capitalists had been, as they developing interrelationships with each other, wanting to expand westward. The new British government blocked that with a proclamation line, wanting also to invest in development and to gain greater independence over its trade. The London government responded, realizing its class enemy, its most powerful class enemy, or the merchant capitalists, whose most important center was Boston, with the Stamp Act. His purpose was to crush that class. The Stamp Act resulted in riots, the creation of a group called the Sons of Liberty. The man of letters, the British man of letters, Samuel Johnson, commented that there were a whole bunch of slaveholders who belonged to the Sons of Liberty. He thought that was funny. But what then follows is a series of escalating conflicts in which the Tory government, through its trade policies, its increased military involvement in the colonies, seeks to put down this developing national capitalist class. And this national capitalist class, in response to these developments, establishes first committees of correspondence, the rest, the Boston Massacre, the response to the Boston Massacre, the great corporation, great English corporation run by swindlers and adventurers, the East India Company, its dumping of tea, the response by leaders of the merchant capitalists, like Sam Adams and others, to dump the tea, literally in Boston Harbor, not a party, but a revolutionary act. And the response of the British government, declaring martial law, and everything that follows, and the war breaks out. Before there is a Declaration of Independence, the war breaks out. And the Declaration of Independence becomes, like the Magna Carta, one of the truly great historical documents, even though, like the Magna Carta, the aims of the people who wrote it were very, very different from the aims of the people who would come to use it. In this context, we find a real revolutionary, a man who took the principles, the radical principles of the British Revolution, of the Rutgers, and brought them here. His name was Tom Paine, and he became the great agitator of the revolution. He was also, among many other things, an abolitionist. He became the voice of international revolution in Britain and in France in the last decades of the 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, the Enlightenment slaveholder, a man who believed in the possibility of everyone learning and developing, including indigenous people, except slaves. Rights influenced directly by Paine, the Declaration of Independence. The war follows. The war is to be won in large part, by the intervention and support that the French Empire provides for its American allies against its British enemies. That's not remarkable. Were it not the Soviet and Chinese support, for example, the Vietnam Revolution would not have been possible. The existence of the Soviet Union limited what the US and its friends could do against the Chinese Revolution. Okay, let me stop for a second. How much time do I have?
10 more minutes.
Oh, I got a lot of time. Okay. So let me stop and I will move ahead on, if I can find it, some very direct materials, and then we can, we'll continue. 10 minutes, wow. What had the revolution accomplished by 1783, when the withdrawal of the British forces took place? Slavery generally in the northern colonies had been abolished, and there was general sympathy for its elimination, although that was unorganized. Feudal vestiges, like primogeniture, where they existed, had been, in effect, ended. Substantial amounts of Tory or Empire Royalist property had been confiscated and would never be returned. Never. Many of the Tories fled to British Canada, and they remind me a little bit of the Cubans for decades after the Cuban Revolution in Florida, waiting for the US to come back and restore everything that they had lost, but that did not happen. But 1783 was hardly the end. Britain was still the most powerful empire in the world. It then launched an economic war against the new state under the Articles of Confederation. A rebellion of debtors, led by a soldier, Daniel Shades, in Massachusetts, was crushed. Samuel Adams, a leader of the Boston Tea Party, was also a leader in crushing the opposition. People change. In the aftermath of that, a new government with a national government and a constitution was drafted. James Madison, a slaveholder and ally of Thomas Jefferson, along with Alexander Hamilton, who perhaps was the most important leader of merchant capital, and this is my interpretation, it's not the interpretation of my party, the man who, if there was to be an American Cromwell, an American Napoleon, an American Joseph Stalin, Alexander Hamilton was the man. That's my view. Anyway, I have a minute or two go forward, and a new government was created. But now we come to a turning point in history. The American Revolution became a very lucky revolution because the French Revolution broke out. The revolution that the Soviets had dreamed about in Europe and did not happen. In a sense, for the American capitalist revolution happened. And this gave the American Revolution time to survive. But what was surviving? In the first term of the slaveholder president, George Washington, free blacks were barred from serving in the army. The 3/5 compromise made slavery a part of the Constitution. You could argue that that was a necessity to maintain the support of the slaveholders, but it was a very, very cruel necessity. The Republic advanced a policy of non-alignment, not isolationism, but non-alignment, similar to, let's say, what the post-independence Indian governments did in the cold and after World War II. In the late 1790s, as conflict developed with the French Revolution, with the directory that had followed the Jacobin dictatorship, the possibility existed of war. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. Alexander Hamilton, actually, we now know that members of John Adams' cabinet were reporting directly to him. And he even got himself a commission to lead an army against the French and Spanish in North America. He believed in rapidly expanding U.S. power. He believed in much more rapid development through the Western Hemisphere. As it turned out, this did not happen. What happened was Thomas Jefferson's victory. What happened, and with Thomas Jefferson's victory and Hamilton's downfall, the revolution went into a new phase. Jefferson talked of liberty. Jefferson talked of republicanism. Jefferson also talked of a continental empire. And the power of the slaveholders increased very substantially. And beginning with Jefferson, and the revolutionary struggles continued. I end the American Revolution as a historical period with the Second Anglo-American War, called the War of 1812, a very important war, which results not in any great territorial settlement, but in a wave of nationalism and the emergence of the man who would become the first political leader in history to use the word democracy, and found a political party which still exists, the Democratic Party. Andrew, yes, Indian killer, slaveholder, and champion of the common man. Yes, Andrew Jackson, emerging as the great hero. And what can we say? The American Revolution, was it a revolution? Of course it was. With all its deformations. Marx, Engels, Lenin saw it in that way. They wouldn't throw the baby, so to speak, out with the bathwater. They denounced the American Revolution because it was a bourgeois revolution of a particular sort in a particular place in history. They understood the role of the slaveholder class in that revolution. And the power of the slaveholder class grew very, very substantially over time. And I've written in response to the 1619 project. James Hoax was supposed to be here. I respect James Hoax, But I don't respect the man who wrote that letter, Sean Markowitz. I don't respect him in 2008 when he denounced Barack Obama's campaign as a racist campaign, similar to the Willie Horton ad. I don't respect him as a political adventurer. And I don't respect what I see as a backlash against the new history of slavery. That backlash, even though the Trotskyist world Socialist Review is backing it in wild and crazy ways, in my opinion, that backlash is a return to the old American exceptionalist consensus celebration of American history that was codified, so to speak, in the high Cold War period after World War II. And it is also potentially very, very dangerous in terms of not only dividing people, but in its distortions, helping the present administration, which I see as a menace to all forms of democracy and people's rights, the Trump administration, from not being ousted. Okay, I can go on and on every point, great detail. But as for that project, in an article I've written, my final words are, I'm not a great fan of Leon Trotsky, but I see him as an important thinker, even though I see him as a flawed thinker. If Leon Trotsky read this from this source, he would say I'm not a Trotskyist. Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's good. You want it? I need it.
Yes. Yeah. I've come, even though I've been more and more puzzled about why the topic for our panel today is revolution. Yes, it's a very important subject, but it's also really easy to understand as a large number of people deciding to change the way their society is organized. Now, how and why any group makes that decision and acts upon it varies a lot, as does the language used in carrying it out. I think it's more important to begin by clarifying the main elements of this language, without which even Marx's occasional, and they are occasional, references to revolution cannot be properly understood. And there is no word that plays a bigger role in both understanding and using the whole of Marxism than dialectics. What I propose to do now is to give you the shortest account of dialectics ever attempted, at least by me, and then suggest how that affects the meaning of revolution. The easiest way to explain dialectics is to start with what it isn't. And it isn't the common sense view that all the elements in both nature and society are separate and independent from one another. They can develop relations with other things, but need not. They can have a history and a future, but neither are essential features of whatever is in question. Whether openly stated or not, things, in quotes, things and relations, in quotes, are treated here as logically distinct from one another. They also appear to be static. Those who have this view which includes the great majority of the people in our society, generally believe that they can learn enough from what they want to know from the evidence directly in front of them. In contrast to what could be called a philosophy of external relations, which I've just characterized, in contrast to this version of thinking about the world, there is also a philosophy of internal. The first view is the philosophy of external relations, and now I want to talk a bit about the philosophy of internal relations, which holds that everything, literally everything, is internally related, both in space and across time, including both the past and the future, likely future. Reality here consists of an infinite number of processes and of different kinds, undergoing change of one kind or another, and at one speed or another, while being in direct or indirect, and very often very indirect, relations with one another. This can also be viewed, and this is maybe I should have begun with this language. This can also be viewed as the bigger picture. The most telling criticism leveled by those who work with the philosophy of external relations, again, the common sense of most people's way of thinking about their lives and their world. The most telling criticism leveled by those who work with the philosophy of external relations against the dialectical approach is that without the boundaries that most people take to exist between the things of this world, there is no way to keep the study of anything from spilling over into everything. If this were so, of course, it would end the debate right here. But is this so? Is it true? Marx resolves this problem with the process of abstraction. The process of abstraction is used in different ways by Marx, but you'll see the special sense in which I'm using it. He also uses it this way. Marx resolves this problem that would exist if, in fact, you didn't do anything but argue that everything is related. And then it seems as if, well, that's so. And also everything is constantly changing, slowly or fast. And if all this is so, and when you can assume it so, then we can't simply control it. We can't do anything with it. We seem to be lost. But Marx comes in at this point and introduces what he calls the process of abstraction, which is simply singling out or focusing on a setting or setting up a provisional boundary over some part of the process and relations which have come to his attention. The actual abstractions that Marx makes are of three different kinds. And again, abstractions is a way of what you tend to focus on. And by the way, nothing is easier than deciding on focusing on certain things and leaving out other things that that are also making noise. That is also something we could see, but you can put these aside and focus on certain aspects of what you're thinking, what you're seeing, and what you're feeling. So the actual abstractions that Marx makes are, but there's three different kinds of abstractions. First, there's the abstraction of vantage point. Where are you sitting or standing or starting from? And of course, that is going to affect what you see and what you hear, what you smell. But this is a choice you can make. Sometimes you just assume the particular place that you are in now, and you then take what you see as what there is. But of course, if you were to turn around or move to a different place in the room, you would be seeing more or less the same things, not all the same things, but a lot of the same things, but the angle from which you view them would have a great effect on what it is you see and the importance it has in whatever you're thinking about or acting on. The second abstraction is abstraction of extension. And this has to do with just how much of what you're bringing into focus you are deciding to deal with, deciding to use in some way. How many of these, if everything is connected, you have a choice of deciding, well, how far to go in making use of these interconnected elements of what is in front of you, or what you're hearing, or something of that sort. And the third is an abstraction. This isn't Marx's language, but I'm trying to use a language which I think is, which applies to what he's doing. The third is abstraction of level of generality. Of level of generality. Now, there are 5 major levels of generality. That is to say, just how much of reality are you going to try to be bringing into your thinking at any particular time. It's connected to the other kinds of abstraction I mentioned, but this begins, what are the 5, I call them levels, and you'll see why in a moment. There's first of all, the human condition. So you can decide to try to understand the human condition and use whatever evidence is available, and you generalize then about human beings, such as we've known them to be from the beginning of the species. Then there is a period where an important change occurs in among human beings, and that is classes develop. Very primitive classes, of course, initially, but this affects very much the kind of relations that people had with each other and the kind of things that they do and try to do. And that is, of course, a much shorter time period as well. That didn't happen until after hundreds of thousands of years, that the first classes emerged and in different places, and they were had all sorts of distinctive characteristics. But that's a particular area, a certain degree of generality. You're bringing into focus, a much smaller space, time, and things going on in that space and time. The third is capitalism, which happened more recently. And here too, this leaves out the more general periods that you could and often do and for different purposes bring into focus, but now you're trying to focus on what is special about capitalism. And by capitalism, I'm thinking of the whole period in which Marx lived, and a little more before and a little bit more after. And that's not everything after, because things were moving pretty quickly by the time Marx came along, and you have a certain set of differences that mark what you call modern capitalism, and a whole number of changes which start taking place toward the end of the 19th century and have increased in how many of them have come about, and how important they've been to our lives in the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century. And finally, there's a 5th level of generality, and that's the here and now, including what's happening right now in this class. And you can focus on that. So in terms of these revolutions, I'll try to bring this to a close in a few minutes. In modern capitalism, which is the period since Marx died up to, let's say, what I call the here and now. In modern capitalism and the here and now, the more sophisticated consciousness of the capitalist class and the lower degree of class consciousness of most workers. I think there's much less class consciousness among workers today than there was in Marx's time. Because of that, and this is mainly due to the efforts of the capitalists becoming more conscious of their interests and therefore more in control of their situation. They already had a great deal going for them in terms of being able to have power over their workers, but it's actually increased. And this has led to the fact that the workers have much less class consciousness. I mean, workers overall in all of the capitalist countries having much less class consciousness, with all sorts of and degrees of exceptions. Now this has left our side, the left, the Marxist side, much weaker than we were in Marx's day, much weaker, and this makes it necessary to think about how we can and should think about and call for a revolution, so that the thinking about revolution must be changed in order to make it fit with the situation that we find ourselves in, which is a much worse situation, though we're much more developed in all sorts of things that affect our lives. But we're so count in terms of the influence we have in the world, whereas it has led to greater power over the world, including the workers of the world, than they had it, than the capitalists had before the 20th and the 21st century. Now enter, this is my conclusion, enter the importance of climate change. What is Ollman bringing in climate change for? I'll tell you why quickly, because maybe we can talk about it in our session. Because I see climate change as both the greatest danger of the existence of our species and the planet, but also a way possibly to help make the revolution which has kept, that we haven't been able to make against capitalism, which wouldn't be possible without it. And the reason for this, and this could go on for another, not only talk, but both try to work on something on this right now. Because I think that in being as responsible as capitalism is for most, by most I mean about 98.9% of what we call climate change. And this becoming more and more obvious to growing numbers of people, not just to teenagers, but many adults are beginning to understand this and worry about it and try to do things about it. Not enough, but beginning to. That in this situation, the criticisms, which are just beginning, I don't think we reached the end and the total power and the amount of the criticisms that are going to be leveled against capitalism for being mostly responsible for this, is mixed up with their role in bringing climate change to the point that it is, and to really make the kind of changes which a growing number of people, and not just people, workers, who have all the usual reasons as workers to be opposed to capitalism, but to many who are not workers, to move for getting rid of climate change. They're beginning to see that that requires, absolutely necessary, requires getting rid of capitalism. There's no compromise possible. And the capitalists, enough of them realize that, since they're trying so hard to hide what they're doing in all sorts of ridiculous ways, but with a certain amount of effects. But how long can that go on as climate change gets worse and it becomes clearer and clearer the role that the capitalists play? So in getting rid of climate change, we maybe have to, and including the great number of workers who are now working on the side of the capitalists, because this is one of the things that has also happened, because they want to keep their jobs. But we can begin to see the possibility that maybe a real attack against capitalism, which has not been possible in the last two levels of generality which we have lived in, maybe it becomes more and more possible as people realize that capitalism must be replaced by, and whatever they call it, it has to be a form of socialism, and eventually we hope communism.
Okay, so I'd like to start with a quotation from Senator John F. Kennedy when he was running for president in 1960. It's a speech that he made in Harlem at the Hotel Teresa. It's a famous speech. He said, "We should not fear the 20th century, for this worldwide revolution which we see all around us is part of the original American Revolution." The longer quotation is this: "I am delighted to come and visit. Behind the fact of Fidel Castro coming to the hotel and Nikita Khrushchev coming to Castro, there is another great traveler in the world, and that is the travel of a world revolution, a world in turmoil. I am delighted to come to Harlem, and I think the whole world should come here, and the whole world should recognize that we all live right next to each other, whether here in Harlem or on the other side of the globe. We should be glad they came to the United States. We should not fear the 20th century, for this worldwide revolution, which we see all around us, is part of the original American Revolution." Any revolution in the United States will express the desire to preserve, sustain, and promote the further development of the original American Revolution. The future of socialism, not merely in North America, but in the whole world, depends on the fate of the American Revolution. But the left today denies this basic truth. Marx called the United States Civil War the alarm bell tolling the time of world socialist revolution in the 19th century. That did not happen as he wanted, but the subsequent rise of the massive world transforming force of American capitalism signaled, and still signals today, the task of socialism. My old comrades in the Spartacus League had a slogan: "Finish the Civil War." It was vintage 1960s New Leftism, in that it was about the civil rights movement and overcoming de jure Jim Crow segregation as a legacy of failed Reconstruction. More than 50 years later, we can say that the task is more simply to complete the American Revolution. Former President John Quincy Adams, the son, not the father, speaking before the United States Supreme Court in the Amistad case advocating the freedom of slaves who rebelled, foresaw the future US Civil War over the abolition of slavery and called it the last battle of the American Revolution. He did not foresee capitalism and its new tasks and future battles. The American socialist Eugene Debs famously said that the 4th of July was a socialist holiday, and that American revolutionary figures such as Jefferson and Lincoln belonged to the struggle for socialism and not to the capitalist political parties of Democrats and Republicans. Today, more than 100 years later, this remains no less true. Up to the 1960s New Left, the American and global left, and socialists and communists all used to know this basic truth. Indeed, mainstream capitalist politics acknowledged this fact of the ongoing task of the American Revolution. Kennedy claimed the revolutionary heritage for the US against the Soviet Union, and even Nixon in 1968, at the Republican National Convention before his election, called for a new American Revolution. Today, Bernie Sanders and Trump call themselves not politicians, but leaders of a movement. Sanders calls for a political revolution in the name of democratic socialism. What they mean, of course, is an electoral shift to support new policies. In 1992, when conceding to Bill Clinton's electoral victory after 12 years of Republican rule, George Herbert Walker Bush, the father, not the son, said that the US accomplishes through elections what other countries require civil wars. We're discussing the meaning of the American Revolution for the left today because we face a general election later this year.
Right.
Such elections for the president and Congress, which have stakes at a global and not merely national level, raise issues of the US political system and its foundation in the American Revolution. The future of the American Revolution is at stake. In the recent Trump impeachment farce, there was at least the pantomime of conflict over the future of the American Republic. Was Trump a threat to the Republic? Were the Democrats and their allies in the deep state permanent bureaucracy? There has been an evident crisis of legitimacy of the political order. Do the rather mild and moderate policy reforms Trump has been implementing and seeks to accomplish amount to a constitutional crisis, threaten a civil war? Despite the overheated language of the Democrats, Trump's confident and rather blasé attitude, and the matter-of-fact constitutional arguments by his lawyers and Republican senators and congressmen seem appropriate, indeed, unimpeachably correct. What about fascism?
Yeah, what about it?
The favored word on the left and even among Democrats speaks to the threat of civil war, extra-legal action, and perhaps violence. There has been the so-called resistance, a term that Attorney General Barr said implied the danger of civil war and even revolution. He also said in the same speech before the Federalist Society last year that the US presidency embodied the perfected Whig ideal of executive authority, as envisioned by Locke and the English Glorious Revolution. That is, a revolutionary ideal of political authority. Mao said to Nixon in China that one finds among the left-wing followers of Marx actual fascists. He was contrite about the results of the Cultural Revolution and admitted its pathology. Today's Maoists and DSA democratic socialists ought to listen and take heed. It is not a matter of wanting the revolution, but rather of its actuality. The struggle for socialism will not be according to the fevered fantasies of today's supposed revolutionaries. A socialist revolution will take place, if at all, on the basis of a mass desire to save society, not destroy it. Capitalism will appear as the threat to America, not socialism. The problem is the exaggerated rhetoric of mainstream politics today. It expresses a partial if distorted truth, that capitalism recurrently produces crises in society over which political conflicts take place. We're in the midst of such a crisis now, expressed by the crisis of the major capitalist political parties, symbolized by Trump and Sanders. It has happened before. The Great Depression brought a sea change in American and indeed world politics. In the US, a change with the political party system through FDR's New Deal coalition overturned the more than 50-year-old post-Civil War and Reconstruction dominance of the Republican Party. The 1960s experienced a new crisis and change of politics with an upheaval among the Democrats and bringing forth not only the new left, but the new right that triumphed 50 years after the New Deal. 50 years after the 1960s, today we're experiencing another change out of the crisis of the new right, the crisis of the Reagan coalition of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and of the culture wars that came out of the new left, and the crisis of American society that followed. The Democrats have desperately sought to stem the tide of Trumpian post-neoliberalism, and indeed against the swell of support for Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism. They have done so on the basis of their prior existing post-60s neoliberal electoral coalition of wealthy progressives, ethnocultural or racial minorities, liberally educated women and others, queers, and what remains of organized labor. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and immigrant rights activists have protested not only against Trump, but have hounded Bernie and his Sandinistas, the much maligned Bernie bros, and millennial hipsters, straight white male brocialists more generally. The squad of congressional representatives, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley notwithstanding. Last year's New York Times 1619 project, led by journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, aimed at delegitimating Trump after the failure of the Russia collusion hoax, in what editor Dean Baquet called the shift from Russia to race. Took the occasion of marking the quarter century of the arrival of African slaves in the English colonies and explicitly sought to negate the American Revolutionary founding of 1776. Trump's presidency seems to prove the invalidity of the American Revolution, and indeed has implied that its meaning was confined to privileged white males who must at all costs be cowed in the public sphere. It seems obvious that women, blacks, and other minorities have no stake in and must disavow the American Revolution. The idea of a kind word being said about the American revolutionaries, the founding fathers, nowadays seems importune, if not simply a provocative offense and outrage. The Tory Alexander Hamilton's musical fame under Obama notwithstanding. This is a sad commentary on our historical moments today. It speaks of the utter and complete destruction of the original historical left, socialism and Marxism. The complete triumph of counter-revolutionary ideology over everything from classical liberalism onwards. Such ideology ensures the continuation of capitalism. However, this is a historical phenomenon only 50 or so years old. It speaks not to the future, but to the past. The millennials blew their chance to relate to history in new ways that challenged and tasked them beyond post-60s doxa. The problem is that the recent and ongoing crisis of the post-60s neoliberal political order has been expressed either by Trump and his new direction for the Republican Party, or by a nostalgic desire to reconstitute the old Democratic Party New Deal coalition that fell apart half a century ago, symbolized by the old new leftist Sanders and the reanimation of the post-60s collapse into the Democratic Socialists of America, both of which date to the Reagan Revolution era of the 80s, and its resistance to that time's neoliberal changes in capitalism. This does not augur new possibilities, but holds to old memories from a time many, if not most, were not yet even alive. Its spectral, unreal quality is evident. The past is not dead, it is not even past, and those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it, are condemned to be trapped by it. These banal catchphrases can hide, but also reveal a meaningful truth, that we are tasked by history, whether or not we recognize it. American history continues regardless. The US president is indeed, as is said, the leader of the free world. As Trump says, America is the greatest country in world history. As his impeachment prosecution declared, his Senate jury is the highest deliberative body in the history of the world. This is simply and undeniably true. Why and how it was constituted so historically is an unavoidable fact of life for people here and around the world, now and for the foreseeable future. Can we live up to its task? My own rejoinder to Trump's Make America Great Again is to make America revolutionary again. But no one else on the left seems to be seeing the sign of the times. Instead, everyone seems eager to rescue the neoliberal Democrats from the dustbin of history. Even Bernie must genuflect to their PC orthodoxy, but not Trump. This is indeed a time of reconsideration of history and its haunting memories. The question is whether they must, as Marx said, remain traditions of dead generations weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living, or can they be redeemed by the struggle for freedom in the present? It seems that the millennial left of the last 2 decades has joined the dead generations that came before it. Any rebirth of a true socialist left and of Marxist recognition of its actual tasks and possibilities must reckon with the history that has been abandoned by recent generations, starting at least in the 1960s, and pursue its unfulfilled potential. For the American Revolution still lives.
Yeah, we'll have the grant.
Okay, sure.
I will take questions. And
We
Unless
should
you-
respond.
Yeah.
Rochelle, let's have a round of response first.
Oh, boy.
In the same order.
Okay. You're beneath it. Okay. Well, Chris, I agreed with what you said, but disagreed very strongly with a lot of what you said. I didn't know you were a member of the Spartacus League. I have a memory of the Spartacus League from the late 1960s. A big demonstration with the Spartacus Leaguers marching together, and their slogans were out of Vietnam, that was good. But then along with these slogans, these anti-Vietnam War slogans, workers of Hanoi, Beijing, and Moscow overthrow your Stalinist rulers. And people were looking at them as if they were crazy. And
But were they right?
many people are right about what is ridiculous and impossible. So no, they
Okay,
weren't.
so
Okay,
I'll
let's
put
put
everything
it-
that I said that you disagree with in that category.
Okay, good. Okay. First, on the 1619 project, there is real danger that the backlash against this project will become, given the language of, quote, racialized scholarship, a backlash against Black scholars. There is a real danger.
She's not a scholar.
No, she's a journalist, but a number of the others are. Khalil Gibran Mohammed is. These articles are not what Chris has portrayed them as, all of them. They're not sympathetic in a big way to the American Revolution, but they're not opposed consistently to the revolution, the ones that have been published, and they reflect younger African-American scholars. There is really much more of a serious criticism of what capitalism has done to American society in these articles than there is in the attack on them. Besides the backlash against these articles, the backlash against this project, besides the danger that a generation of younger African-American historians and journalists will be treated as the blacks of Reconstruction were, as inferior people who've been thrown up by what the right calls political correctness. There's an interesting quick point on that.
They might be exploited though.
Yeah, they can be exploited.
By Democrats.
By the way, yeah, but Chris, if your main enemy is the Democrats and you're going to spend your time fighting the Democrats,
Somebody's got to.
well, a lot of people are, and you can do it. And I'll look at Donald Trump and I'll see him representing the political culture of fascism. Political culture meaning rally, rally, rally. The pseudo-masculine cult of violence, as a German intellectual noted in the late 1920s. The degrading of the identification with vigilante violence at the state level, and the attempt to intimidate traditional bourgeois, center, and even right politicians and organized groups. It's not a fascist state. The communist definition of fascism is the open terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary sectors of the capitalist class. But those are the sectors that support Trump, and in his political culture, Trump is appealing to that, and it can become that. So I take this election very, very seriously, and I have a different view of Bernie Sanders also. He's a social democrat. He's been a social democrat. He doesn't come out of the new left. He reflects social democracy. His themes reflect an attempt to bring back Franklin Roosevelt's economic Bill of Rights. Roosevelt defined that in terms of saving capitalism. Sanders defines it in terms of a new and better society. Will he collapse? Will he fail? Who knows? But I would not, attacking him is in effect aiding and abetting the forces of reaction, in my opinion. Okay. I had some points about Bertell too, but I won't. Since I'm going on and on and on. Okay. There's a very good book. If I can one more comment. There's a very good book on philosophy. And not to be critical of it. It's hard to get now because the estate has sort of blocked it. It's by John Somerville. It's called Philosophy of Marxism. And it deals with philosophy in a way that working people and students can understand. It deals with what is reality, what is progress, what is dialectics, and it is really very, very fun. Somerville himself was a professor at Temple. He has an interesting history. Okay, and I would sort of suggest it. I think it depends on Marxist philosophy, which is not anyway. You got me going, Chris, like the old days. Okay, okay. And okay, so Bertell, Chris. Okay, Chris, you want to? I want to sell it out. But I agree with a lot of what you were saying. I really did. Until you got.
So,
okay.
Okay, you'll come after me. So, well, I didn't think that I was really attacking Bernie. I don't really have any particular animus or interest in attacking Bernie. I might have some doubts about the possibility, and also, in a sense, the necessity, the task of trying to restore a pre-neoliberal, that is to say, a kind of New Deal type situation. So, I would question that, but, the degree to which he is that, and not something else, it's fine. Now, of course, my main concern is that younger people think that etc. So, there's that kind of an issue. I mean, that's all that I really have to say in response, because I don't have much else to say about Trump, except for, everything is the possibility of fascism in a sense. He calls himself a leader of a movement, but that's more of a pose on his part. it's a kind of it's a disavowal of being a professional politician. You know, he gets a lot of people to come to his rallies, but these are not like organized people. Right? There isn't like a movement. He barely has support from the Republican Party. And so, you know, I feel like the Trump phenomenon is pretty much him and maybe Jared and Ivanka, and that's about it. Not even Melania. And Stephen Miller and people like that around him, imagine that they're using him, but he's using them. And, you know, he's cycled through a lot of characters in his administration. And so, you know, there's not much profound to say about Trump. I feel like the attempt to render Trump, especially a profound danger, is clearly something that the Democrats are using and are going to use. And, you know, I don't think that, I don't agree with the historic vantage point going back to the 30s, unite to fight the right. I do not agree with that at all. Because I think that, or which side are you on, etc. I don't think that that is good for the left. I don't think it's good for socialism. I don't think it's good for Marxism. And when I say not good for the left, I mean it's not good even for progressive liberalism to adopt that standpoint, progressive liberal capitalism. So I would, you know, sort of say, I understand that perspective. However, I have serious disagreements with it. And so, you know, prioritizing the problem with the Democratic Party is not a huge priority of mine, but it is something that comes specifically with the DSA phenomenon and with the younger generation's conflation of Democratic Party politics with something that they identify as socialistic. So for instance, thinking of like Obamacare or Medicare for all, public money for private health providers is not at all socialistic, and it's not even particularly progressive liberalism either, right? And just for good measure, we're more likely to get a national health service out of Trump than out of the Democrats, because Trump himself has said that it's absurd that the United States spends as much as it does on healthcare. In other words, as a pure business proposition, the only way that you'll get national healthcare in the United States is if the capitalists decide that the current system costs too much, and therefore it's going to come from someone like Trump. It's not going to come from people saying that it's socialism.
Well, I disagree with you on that last point, 1,000%. Okay.
Bertell?
Well, I'd like to hear more.
Yes.
All right, then I'll take question.
Okay, here we go.
All right.
See if I can use this microphone here. Let's see. Does it work? Yeah, I guess it does. Okay. I was lured to this panel, I think, under partly false pretenses. I thought the topic was going to be the 1619 project, which was alluded to here, but kind of in passing. So I'd like to concentrate on that. Now, you say that the 1619 project, this was a magazine supplement published by the New York Times several months back. 1619 being the date of the first slaves were brought to American shores. Now, of course, and you say this is the work of new black historians, which I assume you approve of. I don't know. I think you can perhaps be more critical. Black historians aren't a homogeneous group like other people. They have different opinions about. They have different opinions about that. But I think that reading the magazine, and especially the lead article, the discourse that emerges there is essentially a black nationalist discourse. For instance, the author of the lead article says, and this is what is one of the things that is most controversial, that black people fought against slavery and racism throughout American history almost alone. Well, what happens in this history to William Lloyd Garrison, to Wendell Phillips, to John Brown? Are they disappeared from history? Now, the people who are objecting, on the other hand, in the World Socialist website, the interviews with historians, you say they represent a backlash. They also have different views. There are right-wing historians who have written about her. And some of them are very right-wing, but one of the people at the World Socialist website, which I don't admire, I mean, I don't admire those people. I think they're an unsavory lot in lots of ways. But one of them was James McPherson, who is an excellent historian, I think, of the Civil War. And that is precisely what he was objecting to, was the black nationalist tinge of this discourse. That says that slavery is the outstanding and most significant fact of American history, and that black people fought against it almost alone. Norman Markowitz, what do you say to that?
Well, I've written 2
Well, I
articles.
didn't read it, sorry.
Okay, I've written 2 articles. The first one is available on the Communist Party USA website on the letter. The second deals with the World Socialist Review in detail.
World Socialist
Website, yeah, it deals with them on the website. My points are these. I say that of the 4 interviewers, they are liberal historians. They're quite good in many ways. One of them, Gordon Wood, is a man who was a teacher when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan 50 years ago. I respond to the letter which they have signed, written by Sean Lentz. And I deal with Sean Lentz in detail in terms of where he's coming from. And I want to talk about neoliberal Democrats. But my point is this. The articles that have been published by both journalists and historians as part of this project, younger black people, are not all the same. I make it clear that Tom Paine, Benjamin Rush, earlier, Quakers, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass, and a great many others, white people, played an essential role in the struggle against slavery. What I say is that slavery has been marginalized in American history, and the history that is being defended by the critics goes back to that marginalization. There are elements of black nationalism in the 1619 project, certainly. And there are other elements, but by and large, there's an attempt to connect up, if you look at the articles. And I make points similar to the articles. Your traffic jam, suburbanization as a result of racism. The brutality of the American political system is connected historically to racism and slavery. And other examples of how the backlashes against the New Deal, against Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program and policy, and whatever you think of the Obama administration against Obama, are deeply connected to this history. And the 1619 project, it may be dialectically the antithesis, challenging an old consensus which is no longer viable, and the response to that old consensus by the critics. 3 of the 4 I consider good historians, represents a backlash, a clear backlash. As an example, when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and these things don't come out of the air, it was the civil rights movement that made all of this possible. It was the civil rights movement that made Great Society possible. It's the civil rights movement that made the women's rights movement and the gains that were made possible. In the late 1960s, when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and the role that the Constitution played, which had been buried in traditional historical discourse, in strengthening slavery and slaveholders, was beginning to be investigated. A whole bunch of establishment historians, like Gordon Wood, they came forward with the argument that the leaders of the American Revolution were basically anti-slavery. They would use Jefferson's opposition to slavery, which was real in the Northwest Ordinance. But then you have to look at what people become. You have to look at the role of social classes in history. And that is why in the second article, I really go after the language of North and London, their lead article, which is filled with denunciations, racialization of history, distorting world history, a polemic that plays directly into the hands of the right and the far right.
Can I just have a little rejoinder?
Yeah, that's my response.
So, I would take issue with some of the ways that you characterize the American Revolution regarding class. In other words, that it's about a capitalist class and this kind of thing. I have a different notion of bourgeois revolution. But let's turn that class analysis to the 1619 project itself. In other words, it's not a black nationalist project. It's a kind of a pseudo-nationalist project. It's really the project of a kind of black Democratic Party managerial class, kind of middle class, kind of professional interest. It's not about black nationalism as a robust ideology by any means. It's just frustration with the Obama administration after 8 years, which is the way that I also see Black Lives Matter and that kind of phenomenon. It's frustration with that. And it's an angling towards keeping the seat at the table with the Democrats. In other words, it's, listen to us and depend on us to unseat Trump, right? And like I said, Dean Baquet was very, very explicit about this, the editorial meeting that was reported. He said, we're going to move from Russia to race to delegitimize Trump. And then they rolled out the 1619 project. And that's it. And it's a passing fad. It's not some sea change in the way we view history. It's very much about this election. It's very much about Trump. It would not have happened if Trump was not in office. If Hillary had been in office, the New York Times would not have done the 1619 project. Let's be real.
Okay, well, I mean, okay, other people, we could go on forever, but okay.
All right, another question.
I guess I will ask my question. So first I have a question for Professor Ollman. I wanted to ask about, you kind of talked about these different levels of generality.
Can you speak up a bit?
Oh, sorry, can you hear?
Yeah, we got.
Okay, different levels of generality, and two of them being the here and now, and then also capitalism. And so to kind of apply that, I think, to the discussion that's happening about the American Revolution, and
Okay, sorry, can you say that again? Someone's
It's your phone up here. So yeah, I got it.
okay, great.
so to apply that to this discussion of the American Revolution and the bourgeois revolutions kind of more generally, I was wondering what you think is, what's different between the American Revolution and and the task of a socialist revolution in the present. And how do you think making a revolution in the here and now, you talked about it as people deciding that they want to change what their society is. How do you think that making a socialist revolution in the here and now would have to deal with the inherited history of the American Revolution in this larger era of capitalism? And then I also wanted to ask kind of a question that relates to the argument that's happening between Chris and Norman. Is the 1619 project seems to posit that the problems of today, and particularly the problems facing Black people in the United States, come from slavery and come from this year 1619, right? It's kind of an image for that, which suggests that 1776 the American Revolution did not transform or do anything to address the problems of slavery. And the Civil War also didn't do anything to address the problems of slavery. It's not true that it's kind of the only mainstream view that, slavery was ended, right? That slavery's been not talked about in American history. The anti-revisionist school of the 80s, all of the writers in the 80s in American history sought to argue very strongly that the institutions of slavery survived the Civil War into the late 19th century against kind of the, I guess he's like the hotshot of American Southern history, Woodward, who argued that, well, no, actually the racism that we face now, Woodward was writing in the 50s, comes not from slavery. It doesn't come from the Civil War. It comes from this historical period in the 1890s, really. And so the question is the problem, as somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, or somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones would say, is the problem that America's always been white supremacist, that it's always been racist? Or did the American Revolution do something? And so how are we supposed to talk about the problems of the present in relation to the American Revolution and in relation to the institution of slavery?
I can respond to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yes, first, sorry.
Microphone.
Here.
Okay. I tried to talk about the bigger picture. Marx believed that he needed to get a sense of the bigger picture before he broke it down into the different topics that he wrote about in his works. But there is first an effort to see the bigger picture. Now that's very important because that first step of trying to get a sense of what the bigger picture is before you set out dealing with some part or some number of the bigger pictures of the important problems that we have, and we must have touched in the half an hour since we finished our first discussions. We must have touched about 20 smaller problems, if not more. And I'm sure there's more that is going to come out in the rest of our discussion. That's unfortunate because I don't think enough attention is being given to the bigger picture, which is going to influence all of these particular problems that we have. And it's essential that we see, for me, and I've been very concerned with the bigger picture before going on to the other problems, which are very important. But there has been this development which got going really in the early years of the 19th century in the field of education, breaking things down. So the disciplines have been divided, and what was left was divided into other disciplines. And what we now have is an academy where once people come to a university, almost any university, and almost any field, they're going to go into great detail about it could be an important piece, but some piece of a problem in their discipline and not even look at the connections with the other problems that are covered in their discipline, and certainly not make bridges to the other fields. And the result is that you can't really get a handle on any of these parts, certainly not well enough to make the kind of changes which are needed, because they are real problems, because we have avoided giving the kind of attention which I tried to give in my way of showing what I think was the major part of the bigger picture, which is now the relationship between what's happening in the climate and what's happening in the social, political fields, which are including wars, which are going on. And I think until this is done, we won't be able really to solve most of the particular problems which have been raised here, and we certainly won't be able to see that the kind of connection which I drew very quickly at the end of my talk between where climate changes has brought us and it will bring us in the very near future, and how that's going to affect all the problems which have come about during the capitalist epoch. And it will be a way of getting rid of all the problems, but getting rid of us along with our problems. So that I think it's unfortunate that you haven't seen that bigger picture needed to be at least recognized and made a part of what you think has to be dealt with, and then gone on to whatever the particulars are that you want to also deal with, and which need dealing with. But there is an order to be followed here. And I haven't seen anyone following that order besides me. And that's unfortunate.
The second question, okay. The second question, let me say that a good place to start would be to read a classic Marxist influenced work by a man who in Ghana joined the Communist Party of the United States, W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction. And the failure to democratize through revolutionary land reform the conditions of life for the masses of Southern people, both former slaves and poor whites, doomed Reconstruction, and what followed with the support of the capitalist class, increasingly an industrial capitalist class, was the acceptance of what was, my interpretation of it, is a racist dictatorship in the southern states. It was not slavery, but it functioned as a racist dictatorship, and that is important in understanding American, to me, foreign policy, because if Mississippi in 1890 is a free state, then Cuba under Machado and Batista, South Korea on the Sigmund Reef, all of the governments, Duarte right now in the Philippines, the coup created regime in Bolivia, they represent victories for democracy. And if you accept that, then racism, institutional racism, which the industrial capitalists and their allies carried forward, inherited from the slaveholders, that is their legacy, their great legacy, is central to understanding the worst of American history, right up to this day. That's what I would say to you on that point. And the American Revolution strengthened slavery. The Civil War was, in Marxist terms, more of a revolution because it led to the destruction of a major part of what had been the ruling class, the Southern slaveholders. They never were restored as slaveholders, and their states became a kind of internal colony. Okay, that was a thing.
So let me preface what I'm going to say in response to Bertell. I actually appreciated your initial presentation a great deal, especially the separation of levels. I would define the levels maybe somewhat differently than you ended up doing. But we can kind of leave that aside for the time being. And so let me, now that I've said that, kind of throw a wrench into the works and say we wouldn't be talking about climate change in this catastrophic way if Trump were not in office, if Hillary had been elected. We would not. Let's be real about that. In other words, if the US stayed in the Paris Accords, there would not be this level of public discourse. There would not. There would be some discourse. There already was discourse under Obama, and there was discourse before that. There was Al Gore with The Inconvenient Truth, but not at this pitch of catastrophism that we're experiencing under Trump. It would not be the case. So I do think that the different levels are important, but I don't think that therefore, and I would challenge you in terms of thinking of it dialectically, I don't think that because the climate change crisis ostensibly threatens the human species. I, for one, don't think that the human species is threatened. I think it's threatened with a lot of misery, but not with utter annihilation. I think that millions of people could suffer horribly, huge displacements and wars could take place. The human species is not going to be wiped out by climate change, right? People are going to suffer a great deal. We might plumb new depths of human suffering the way the 20th century plumbed the depths of human suffering in a way that the 19th century would have been horrified to see. The 21st century might bring us new horrors that are unimaginable, but the human species, for better or worse, will probably continue. Not only that, capitalism will continue, most likely. So in terms of the different levels, I would say, well, why try to grasp capitalism from the level of the natural environment why not try to grasp the natural environment from the level of capitalism? Right? But I think that the implication is first things first we have to deal with basic material conditions. I would say first things first, we have to deal with politics. Because without politics, we can't act with respect to the environment.
Another question? You in the back.
Yeah, first of all,
Speak into the mic.
Press speak.
yeah, first of all, Chris, you referred to Hamilton as a Tory. That's just obviously incorrect.
No, people refer to him that way. I'm not alone. I didn't come up with that.
But anyway,
I did not come up with
but
that.
the point is that he was obviously a bourgeois revolutionary.
No. Tory does not mean. Yeah.
He wasn't a Tory. Okay, this is the factual question.
Factual, no. It's a matter of interpretation, and there's rhetoric in his lifetime and subsequent in the historiography that referred to him as a Tory.
Yes.
I did my research before writing that word in there.
Okay, who are you talking
So
about?
I'll show you. I'll show you.
Hamilton.
Okay, but anyway, I would make the argument, and I could quote R. Palmer, that Hamilton was a bourgeois revolutionary just as much as Jefferson.
Microphone.
Despite that he was a bourgeois revolutionary just
Yeah.
he was a
Listen,
bourgeois
we're now living
revolutionary
under
just as
Obama. The
much.
Hamilton
He was
musical
born-
is no longer on Broadway. So,
Okay, listen,
okay, we can just.
we were talking about, I had to, the second point is going to the question of climate change. I do not understand the argument that climate change cannot be addressed under capitalism. The cause of climate change is carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Capitalists can make profits from coal mines, they can also make profits from zero emission vehicles.
Yeah.
All serious attempts to address climate change now are within the framework of capitalism. That's true of the Green New Deal, whether in the Democratic left wing of the Democratic Party version or the Green Party version. Everybody who's serious about it is talking about doing it in terms of some form of regulatory reform under capitalism. Carbon taxes, emission control, whatever. So you're talking about a regulatory regime under capitalism. Now, the more seriously you take climate change, the more dramatic the fear, the greater should be the need to hope that it can be addressed under capitalism, because it's very unlikely that we will have a world socialist revolution to address it in time, right? So, I find like this dogma that people seem to believe that because of climate change, people will turn to socialism completely incredible. Finally, you said something about the claim that the American Revolution strengthened slavery.
Yes.
Like directly, what is your basis for that claim?
Well, it strengthened slavery. Okay. First, let me say that I agree with you, some of your points, particularly on Hamilton, but I would say the American Revolution, as it developed, and I define the American Revolution not only in terms of 1776, it's the events that go from the 1760s to the 1820s, and that revolution put slavery with the 3/5 compromise into the Constitution. That revolution also would, with Jefferson's victory, limit the power of land, of property owning free blacks. That revolution, as Jefferson and his successors came to define it, and it's important for us to remember that from 1789 to 1860, 48 years of the 72 years of the American presidency, slaveholders were president, and the last two presidents, non-slaveholders, were seen by anti-slavery activists and supporters, abolitionists, as much, if even more, pro-slavery. So in that sense, while the Civil War destroyed slavery, the American Revolution, and for that matter, the British Revolution, and the development of capitalism, commercial capitalism, creating markets for sugar, tobacco, and later, more importantly, cotton. And I can quote Karl Marx, even in the Poverty Philosophy, where Karl Marx makes the point that the foundation of this system, and he says it infinitely better than I or even Chris and the rest of us, was created by the products of slave labor. The products of slave labor. So that's what I meant. That's what I meant. And I also, if Hamilton had won the slavery, but not because he was a bourgeois Democrat, because he saw it as inefficient and backward. And I believe he would have pursued an abolitionist policy. The history of the American working class might have been more in the European tradition. Maybe we can debate that. And also in terms of climate change, you're right, capitalists can make money out of anything, but and they have shown that over and over again. But, remember Lenin's famous comment, the capitalist would sell the rope that would be used to hang him. Okay, a joke of the past, but the most reactionary sectors of the capitalist class, military contractors, the owners of coal mines, the oil companies, they are the strongest supporters right now of Trump. And I still say Trump has given us the political culture of fascism, although not a fascist state. And that's why picking him is the first part, or the first part of it. Okay, thank you.
Can I respond to? I'm shocked to find any climate change deniers in the room. I really am.
Who denied it? Who denied it?
Well, insofar as you think that capitalism can continue, it sounds like, if not indefinitely, at least for a very long time, with what's happening around the world, some places obviously much faster, much worse than others, but it's happening at such a speed. By the way, I gave a course on climate change. That's made me the world's leading expert, but I did have to go through an awful lot of literature, and there's just, and I have a section of my office now, almost to the top of the two sides of the wall of articles, of books, and so on. I haven't read it all, but I've seen enough, and I wasn't feeling like I feel now about just how serious it is and how soon it's going to get much worse. I'm not talking about decades. I'm talking about a decade. And I think that I'd love to be wrong. Look, I'm not making waves and publicity for people I like, but the capitalists are going to, eat the last amounts of profit that they can make out of what they're doing, and when they say, but they're crossing lines. I mean, in some areas those lines are already crossed, and the world is all interconnected, and and it's happened to various. It's happened already to some species of animals, species of plants. Look, you really need to, if you believe what I just heard from one of the people in the audience and from one of my co-speakers, you really have to read more of the literature on it, and don't stop. I mean, I didn't start by leaving this views I'm holding now, but and I knew, of course, that it was happening decades ago, but I didn't realize how fast and how bad it was taking place, and that it really trumps everything else. Now, that doesn't mean I don't also want to make the changes that people have addressed in other areas of our world that need to be changed very fast as well. But this one seems to have run out in the front, and if you take what I see as a rather casual attitude toward it, then I'm going to leave this building even sadder than I came, talking about the dangers of climate change.
I'm not taking a casual attitude, but let's say you're right about the most dismal forecast. I mean,
Can you speak up again?
let's suppose that you're right about the most extreme forecast.
Yeah.
Let's take that for granted. I was just reading an article in The Guardian today about the worst case and the best case scenario. Let's suppose that you're right. I'm not arguing about that. What I'm saying is, how would you avert that catastrophe? All the policies that anybody seriously proposes are policies that presume the continuation of capitalism.
No, I don't have such a policy.
Your only solution is the
No,
expropriation.
I don't have, I mean, there are people who don't have such a policy. We're just few, and most of them do make the kind of compromises that you seem willing to make, because we talk too much about other problems. I mean, you've got to shift in terms of where most of these discussions have to be about the climate change problem, and then we can talk about all these other things. I think you have it wrong. I think you have it, and this wasn't always my views, but I think you have it wrong in terms of what the problems that they have not included. What I see is the world's major problem,
So
and has to be dealt with.
I'm ignorant on this question. Is anyone forecasting the literal extinction of the human species?
Yeah, me.
Yes.
Well, no,
Maybe,
scientific-
yeah, of course, many,
literal,
many,
like
growing number.
Not virtual, but
Okay,
literal.
literal,
Like
yes,
the
yes,
Earth will be uninhabitable by
Yes.
any human at all.
by any human at all.
If you take the extreme case of a runaway greenhouse effect, that is not by most people considered a very serious.
Do you
problem.
speak on all that?
If you take the scenario of a runaway greenhouse effect,
Yeah.
that the Earth turns into something like Venus, right? That scenario, the most extreme scenario, right? But of course, there can be catastrophe without the most extreme.
Yeah.
The most extreme scenario is not considered likely or significant probability by most experts. I'm not denying the seriousness of greenhouse of gases or climate change. I'm not at all. What I'm saying is that the people who are most raising the concern over that are advocating solutions within capitalism. I have read both the programs of the people within the Democratic Party who are calling for the Green New Deal and the people in the Green Party who are calling for a somewhat more left-wing Green New Deal. Both of those are programs totally within capitalism.
Right.
They're not about abolishing capitalism.
Right.
All
We
the
read
UN conferences, they're all about within capitalism.
Yes.
So I'm saying the idea that the only way one can address climate change is socialism seems to me to pose a false dichotomy.
But look, you talked about people in the political parties. I'm talking more about scientists. And I think the scientists have gone way beyond most of the scientists. And the scientists in dozens of different fields, because we can't simply talk about, the heat and a few other areas which can make life impossible on this planet, but it's happening in dozens of different fields, which are all interrelated. No, but the situation
Can I bring
is
it
far
back
worse
to-
than you.
Can I bring it back to the American Revolution for a second?
Well, you can, but I'm just saying,
Since it's the topic.
but what I'm saying is that as important as the American Revolution was, and revolutions, political revolutions today could be if they were, yes.
No, the
But
reason-
I think it's the wrong thing to talk about.
Okay, so that was the topic of the discussion.
That's what I thought.
And so, bringing it back around to it,
Okay.
why I say that the discussion, the public discourse, and especially the catastrophism, is really a response to Trump's election and the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Well, my interpretation of circumstances is such. The reason that I say that is that clearly people think that what the United States does policy-wise is immensely consequential. And the Trump response to that, which I think we have to acknowledge has at least a kernel of rationality to it, is that actually the policies of China and India are perhaps more consequential than the policies of the United States. And so his attitude is, why is it that the US should assert moral leadership when in practical terms, it's less consequential than Chinese and Indian policy? In which case, we're back in the political realm. Meaning, if the US does have a privileged role in the world political order, and if US policy is consequential in that respect, it's not literally because the US is producing more carbon emissions than other countries. It's actually decreasing its emissions. It comes down to whether one thinks that this is a matter of moral leadership or political leadership. And if it's political leadership, then clearly the world order as presently constituted under capitalism does not allow the United States to take a particularly privileged role, right? And this is why Trump is interpreted as isolationist, withdrawing from empire, right? This kind of thing, nationalistic, and it's kind of like a little America approach as opposed to globalization and trying to be a world leader. So, trying to bring it back around to it, in what way would the US be able to claim any kind of political leadership over global capitalism and the possibility for socialism? It would be in the revolutionary tradition of the American Revolution and its world historic importance. And so that's how I would bring it back around. Because in literal material terms, China and India are more consequential in terms of carbon emissions. And so if you're going to say that there's a special responsibility for the United States, what is that actually based on? It's based on the revolutionary tradition and the possibility of leading the world to socialism.
Okay, a good way to do that would be for a socialist America developing its path to unite with a socialist China, developing its path, abandon support for the Modi government. We could go forward, and I just I'm sure you've heard of Barry Commoner and his writing, and he was a social democrat who made this important point that you have to go not simply to regulation, but to the point of production. You have to develop industrial technologies that, not the products necessarily only, but industrial technologies which will end the pollution. And you will need international planning to achieve that. And is that possible under capitalism? You would say no.
Ish.
Yeah, okay, I would say that. I would say that too. So on that issue, these are points that we should be moving forward. And I still say, in terms of Trump, believe me, there is no redeeming social value of any kind in his administration. And if you are seriously interested, there are the works of David K. Johnson, which I suggest to my classes on what Trump has done, beyond all the nonsense. What Trump has done more than anything is to pack much of the executive and much of the judiciary with reactionaries and incompetents and thieves. Reactionaries, incompetents, and thieves. And he's done that on a level that no one else has. And I agree with Johnson on that. Johnson's not a Marxist, and that he's not a socialist by any means, but his books are very useful in looking at what Trump has been doing once you get past all the nonsense.
Somebody else.
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yes, we try.
If there are no other questions, we can do 2 questions at a time. No.
Thanks. My question is to Professor Ollman. So it has to do with the periodization you mentioned with the levels of abstraction. You characterize the fourth phase as modern capitalism.
Say it again.
You characterize the fourth level of abstraction as modern capitalism coming out of late 19th century. And then the fifth phase, the here and now is what you called it. And before you mentioned climate change at the end, first you mentioned class consciousness. So you mentioned less class consciousness in the fifth phase. So I'm curious, how would you characterize class consciousness? Why and how did it regress? When did this fifth phase begin? And is it related to what Chris was talking about with the disavowal of the American Revolution?
Starting in the 60s.
Maybe we can all answer it in 5 minutes.
Yes.
Um,
You can't use you can't use a crayon to draw the lines because the things aren't broken up in that clear, finished way. At the same time, a number of changes And as we move forward into the here and now, the last stage, what's happening in the world today, the changes which are occurring in all areas of our life are occurring faster than before. And they're internally related in various ways, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. And that can be not only directly, but indirectly. And consequently, they create both problems and opportunities. And therefore, and in terms of what I was talking about, in terms of making the kind of changes that socialists and left-wing socialists and communists want to make, more opportunities to do it, and certain opportunities that may have existed a stage ago has disappeared. And so, but this is the way one must look at it. That the problem is too often looked at totally, but that misses the point that what are being most important in terms of their influence are different in each of these levels of what I'm calling levels of generality. And that's why it's important in our thinking. This is where the dialectic comes in, because the dialectic is a way of thinking before it's a way of practice, because I think of dialectics also as a way of practice. Engels and Marx both understood it that way. But it's first a way of thinking. And I think until people begin to think, and it's very hard to do this because all of us here are too old to do this. We're already stuck in the way that, not completely, we can make progress. We can make it progress, but it's very hard to do. And that's essential for getting on top of and dealing with what is really going on in a way where we can see what a revolution would mean. Because my problem with the title of our talk today is that we are dealing too general a way with revolution. And in a general way, you can say something about it, but you can't say something about it which will get you closer to making the kind of revolution that I think most of the people here would like to see. But I think that was a helpful way of getting clear, helping to do the kind of thinking that class analysis makes possible. And we want to make us all more class conscious in the way that Marx talked about. And then class struggle becomes a more realistic alternative with large numbers of people and not with a relatively small number of people who are workers. The problem with workers who are now supporting reactionaries is a relatively new one. I mean, when before has we've never had a reactionary president like Trump before, but when before has a far, far left president? Well, maybe Germany is an example, where eventually, after Hitler killed and jailed so many of the people on the left, an awful lot of too many workers, we either joined the Nazi Party or we had friendly attitudes toward the Nazi Party in the early years before the wars got started there. But this is something that dialectics is essential, and dialectics isn't much used. It's surprising how little people know. I'm sure everyone here has heard the term, but people here haven't seen what is necessary in order to actually put it to use in your thinking. And I think it'd be relevant to all the topics that we discussed in a way which hasn't really happened, except to a very small degree so far.
Jane?
There's also a question from the live stream just after.
Last night during his talk, Spencer Leonard mentioned something that stuck with me, which was that revolutionaries during the time of the Civil War thought that when slavery was abolished, slavery would be over, and they did not anticipate having to deal with anti-Black racism.
Right.
So with that in mind, I'm wondering how we might understand the lasting effects of chattel slavery in America for the working class in the United States, if not racism.
I can respond to that. Something that we must always fight against. Civil rights, the forces who are anti-racist, anti-sexist, the forces that are opposed to all forms of oppression, is not to sit back and have the achievements of the past become hostages to prevent achievements of the future. Not to say, we can free the slaves and it's over. or Martin Luther King died to end segregation and it's over, or the old commercial, the capitalist commercial, we've come a long way, baby, in terms of women's rights. Okay, and the focus really should be on the struggles which will then carry forward. In the 1930s, the Communist Party played a leading role in the campaign that would result in Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wages, and the formation of the industrial unions. The Communist Party was the subject of massive persecution after the Second World War, and capitalists made the very word communist into a word that most people, probably still today, people here are afraid to use. After the Civil War, abolitionists were admired, but the issues that they fought for were defeated. In a sense, abolitionists played the role of a organizing revolutionary vanguard, creating the Republican Party, eventually losing support in that party, etc. And the capitalists won out. They won out in the United States, industrial capitalists, after the Civil War, and they won out after World War II because they controlled 80% of the investment capital of the whole world. And for them, it was a question of, if you advance the New Deal, you have peace with the Soviets, you don't interfere in the Chinese Revolution. Revolutionary forces were advancing through the world, and you could lose everything. Or if you turn the ideology of anti-fascism into anti-communism, and you take over all of the old empires, you could win everything. That's what they did. It worked, so to speak, in bad ways. It worked positively in terms of economic expansion until the 1970s. And when it stopped working, not only here, but globally, over the last 40 years, we've seen governments pursuing policies, both social democratic and conservative, and in this country, both Republican and Democratic, policies of austerity, wage repression, called globally neoliberalism, not liberalism in the American sense of that word. And we've seen the rise of neo-fascist movements and parties. In Europe, these movements and parties are seen as neo-fascist because of people's understanding of what fascism is. In the United States, they're called all kinds of things, right-wing populist, et cetera. And I don't think consciousness of the working class struggle is going on today. It's going on. The working class is a class in itself. The question has always been to make the working class a class for itself. The working class is far stronger than it was when Karl Marx was alive in terms of numbers, and that is its great strength. And if you count the non-owners, the non-investors, et cetera. And it's a question of finding strategies, political strategies, to educate, organize, and coordinate the struggles with the class. And so that's my answer to you on those points. And I think, whatever differences of opinion Chris and I might have, I think we agree on most things. I would hope so.
There's a question from the live stream. So this isn't my question, this is Panelist's question from the live stream. Professor Markowitz, you said that if Hamilton would have been successful, it would have been better for working people in the early 19th century. Working people, however, saw Jefferson as the champion of the common man. How would you reconcile this difference? What did the working people of America see in Jefferson that the left today does not?
Well, maybe I was misunderstood a little bit, so I'll try to explain myself. Alexander Hamilton would have advanced industrial development and would have seen the creation of an industrial working class more, not less quickly. That's what I believe. He would have opposed slavery. He would have established policies that would have advanced industrial development in terms of infrastructure development. Life for the working class would not have necessarily been so wonderful. The cities would have developed more rapidly. The effect of that kind of government and policy would have meant that one of the unique aspects of American as against European false consciousness, to use the term, is that Americans have been taught that anybody can be a capitalist. Anybody can be rich and free. Anybody can be a business owner. And if you're not successful, then it's your fault. The taxpayer, the producing masses are the capitalists themselves. And that consciousness, it's different from, let's say, the traditional Tory worker consciousness in Britain, which went, we are workers, we are where we are, we're basically inferior people. We have, and we should support the conservative party. But that thinking, when it clashes with reality, can easily become, why am I not successful? It's the Jews. It's the blacks. It's the foreigners, et cetera, et cetera. And that's happened over and over and over again. This is a ruling class university. And it always has been. I teach at Rutgers University, which is a public university. It's not a ruling class university. This one little anecdote, I have deep hostility still to Columbia University for a very simple reason, and it stays with me. When I graduated high school in 1962, I was rejected from Columbia. Now listen, people I went to school with who had lower grades were accepted. And I was naive. I came here, and one of the admissions people, he was a guy who was a crew cut. And I said, well, why has this happened? And he turned to me and said, and it's 1962, I'm 18 years old. He said, you people are very competitive, aren't you? You people were Jews.
Yeah.
There was a Jewish quota.
The quota.
The quota also affected others.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, blacks were non-existent. That stays with me.
Certainly
it
things
doesn't
have changed
overcome.
since then.
Oh, yes, of course. But it doesn't mean that my class consciousness is eroded because my parents never went to high school. Both of them. But I'm happy to be here today because I see your faces and I know you are not that guy, and believe me, if that guy were around, none of you would be here. Certainly no women would be here. And looking at the rest of your faces, virtually all of you would not be here, maybe a few. How many of you are good white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? Male. Gee, wow. Trump would call that fake news.
No more questions, I suppose.
On that note,
I was good to be here.